and pushed her plate back. She looked directly at Prosser. Her eyes seemed to burn into his, and he moved slightly nervously. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked. "No, I'm just not as hungry as I thought I was," and she sipped her coffee noisily. It was cold. She motioned to the waitress for more coffee. "Why did you tell me that story?" Anne asked. Prosser held his breath for a second, then exhaled slowly and relaxed. "I don't know why this seminar is being held, but I do know why the last one was held and what it was about. I just thought you needed to know too, just in case. Is this the reason you were so interested in me when we were in Tulsa City?" "That's part of it. Now I need to know why you're interested in me." Anne felt the blood begin to rise in her face, but was brought back by a familiar voice. "Hello, detective," the voice said. Anne looked up to see B.J. Lassiter, the editor of the Tulsa City Crier, walking toward her booth. A feeling of relief came over her, and she was glad her conversation had been interrupted. "Well, well, look at who's here," Anne said with a grin. She liked the editor from Tulsa City. "Come on over and have a seat." Looking at Gerald Prosser, she said, "You won't mind if Tulsa City's ace reporter joins us, do you, Mr. Prosser? Will you, Mr. Prosser?" Prosser stood up and said, "No, of course not," and he offered his handshake to the Crier editor. Lassiter shook the extended hand vigorously and preferred his own to Anne, who accepted it in a like manner. He sat down and motioned the waitress over and ordered coffee. Anne felt her appetite returning with this change of events and reached for her plate. "I knew you couldn't eat just one bite," said Prosser with a chuckle. "When did you get here?" asked Anne. "Just this morning," said Lassiter. "I stayed in a motel in Westchester and came on in early to miss the traffic. Probably should have come on last night, but I got sleepy. Old age, I guess." "Are you going to stay here tonight?" Anne asked. "I don't know," Lassiter says. "It depends on what happens at the seminar." Prosser slyly winked at Anne and asked what could possibly happen at a seminar. Lassiter said, "You never know. A lot of things go on behind the scenes, sometimes that most of us don't even know about." He looked at Anne. "You ever been to one of these?" he asked. Anne said she hadn't. Lassiter said he went to one quite a few years back and still wondered about how and why that one went the way it did. He kept looking at Anne. "We had a Tulsa City cop at that one, too," he said. "Afterwards, he left Tulsa City for the big time. I don't think the change turned out to be too good, though. At least for him, it didn't. He retired early for some reason." "Do you know what the seating arrangement is?" Anne asked to either man. Prosser said, "We're in the fourth row aisle." "We're in the fourth row aisle." Lassiter chuckled. "Yeah, right next to me." "This should be interesting," Anne said airily. It was getting closer to start time for the seminar, and Anne excused herself to go to her room before things got going. She needed a few minutes to get her thoughts together. She needed to determine how she would approach Prosser and when to do so. All of a sudden, she felt very inadequate. She almost wished the voice were here to advise her. Almost, but not quite. Anne brushed her teeth and checked her hair to assure she was presentable to the public. The seminar was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock sharp, and it was now 7:15. She decided to go on down to the meeting room and check things out. Maybe she would see someone else she knew, although that wasn't very likely, considering how few people she actually did know. The hotel lobby was beginning to get busy, and folks were getting off the elevators and crisscrossing the lobby, going in and out of the front door. Anne watched the lobby for a while and wondered what business so many people had at this time of morning. She wondered if everyone else was wondering the same thing. She walked to the entrance of the conference room where the seminar would be held. On a table right next to the entrance was a stack of seminar programs. Anne picked one up and thumbed through it. It had a picture of a detective badge on the front page with the inscription, "Defend and Serve," on it. On the second page was an index that listed the different lectures and lecturers, the times and durations, and a short summary of each topic. One topic title appeared a little amateurish to Anne. It read, "How do we solve crimes, really?" Anne thought, really? A voice behind her asked, "Really what?" She turned to see B.J. Lassiter, and she realized she must have spoken aloud. She handed the program to Lassiter and pointed out the title. He perused it quickly and agreed with a grin. Yeah, really, it does kind of grab you, doesn't it? And left that program with the crier editor and picked up another one. She moved through the door of the hall and looked around. There were already quite a few people there, and their mingled voices were an audible hum. Anne turned to Lassiter and asked, "Do you want to go ahead and be seated?" "I don't think so. Not quite yet. I want to watch and see who else comes in first." Anne agreed, and they moved to the left side of the entrance, just out of sight of anyone entering, and stopped. Anne saw a movement on the stage and recognized the sound man, Gary. He looked up and waved to her and Lassiter, and they responded with waves of their own. It was now 7:40, and more people were starting to file in. Lassiter wondered aloud where Prosser was. Anne looked at him, but didn't say anything. Just then Prosser walked through the door and looked down the aisle toward their seats. He stopped and looked around and saw Anne and Lassiter. "There you are," he said. Lassiter grinned and nodded. "Yep, we're here. How about it? You want to go ahead and take our seats?" He asked them both. Anne responded by starting down the aisle. When she got to the fourth row, she stepped aside for the men. She wanted to sit on the aisle. Both men entered the row and sat down. Anne sat and continued to examine the room and its inhabitants, searching for anyone familiar. It was a ways back to the entrance, but she wanted to get one more look in that direction before settling in all the way, so she turned to look back toward the door. She felt the hair stand up on the back of her neck as she glimpsed the back of a man just stepping through the door, headed out. She caught only a very brief glimpse, but something about that back seemed annoyingly familiar. She felt her breathing increase slightly and her heart rate speeded up, as if she had been jogging. "I'll be right back," Anne said, as she quickly stood up and started toward the door. Prosser stood too, but by the time he turned toward the aisle, Anne was halfway to the entrance, so he sat back down. "Where the hell's she going?" he heard himself say aloud. Lassiter was looking bad too and said, "Maybe she has to answer the call." Anne reached the door just a couple of seconds and stepped through quickly and looked around. The lobby was teeming with people, some leaving the hotel and others walking toward her, probably headed into the conference room. Anne hurried to the front exit and stepped outside the hotel and looked around. She saw no one who looked familiar. However, whoever it was she thought she had seen was gone. She went back into the hotel and back to her seat and sat down. "What was that all about?" asked Lassiter. "I thought I saw someone I knew," Anne said, "but I guess I was wrong." She checked her watch and said, "It's about time for this thing to get started." Just then a voice boomed through the loudspeaker. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Defend and Serve Seminar. I'm Detective Lieutenant Floyd R. Johnson of the Philadelphia Police Department, and I'll be emceeing the seminar. Please sit back and relax, and we'll get started. I trust each of you picked up a program from the table at the entrance of the hall." These three agreed they had indeed picked up programs scheduled, and all three perused them. When the first speaker, a forensic evidence expert, started his spiel, it became obvious this seminar would be very unexciting. He spoke in monotone and using a large blackboard, dealt more with numbers and graphs, with probability averages rather than with actual hard evidence. His presentation lasted a very long and boring hour. Anne squirmed in her seat, as did Prosser, and B.J. Lassiter made a few notes on a notepad, then returned his pen and pad to their hiding place in his inside jacket pocket. By lunchtime, three more speakers had covered three more very dull and boring subjects, and Anne began to wonder if this was why her fellow officers had expressed no desire to be the representative attendee from Tulsa City. When the announcement to break for lunch was made, there was a unanimous sigh of relief from all present, and Anne and her cohorts hurried to be among the first out of the hall. They went to the restaurant and found a booth and were seated. A waitress appeared immediately with 3 glasses of water, and Anne ordered a cheeseburger and a coffee, and the men gave their orders of 2 house specials of meatloaf, and the waitress left. Their orders came surprisingly quickly, and Anne wondered aloud if they had been pre-prepared and kept heated. The waitress grinned and suggested Anne was a very apt detective. She had guessed it. The three ate in silence, each reluctant to mention the seminar. Finally, Lassiter said, "I could have left my pen and notebook at home for all it's been needed. What a bust this has been so far." He looked at the others, ready for their response, and it came quickly. Both Prosser and Anne agreed the seminar so far had been both tedious and boring. Prosser quipped he could be covering an obit right now instead of this, and it would be very little different since both were dead. After the lunch break, the three of them returned to the hall in their seats. Each hoped the second half of the first day would be more informative, if not entertaining, and each had decided to make this the last day if things didn't get better. Lieutenant Johnson, the MC, stepped up to the mic and greeted the crowd of listeners with a robust, "Howdy, folks," and a few folks howdied in response. Then Lieutenant Johnson said something much unexpected. He said, "You may have noticed the first half of today's seminar was extremely dull. Does anyone agree?" There was silence for a second, then half or more of the detectives et al. Loudly voiced an agreement. Somebody said, "Damn tootin', it's been the shits, a waste of time." And someone else asked when the real thing would get started. Lieutenant Johnson was quiet for a moment, letting it all sink in. Then he said, "I have a surprise for you that might pick things up a bit. There is a detective out there who has been an inspiration to a lot of us, whether she knows it or not. She wasn't told she would be part of this seminar, and I sincerely hope she will agree to speak to us for a while." And he looked directly at Anne and said, "Let's put our hands together and ask Tulsa City's top detective, Ann Barton, to honor us with her presence on this stage." There was a thunderous applause as every head turned in Anne's direction. She was stunned. It took a second for what was happening to sink into her consciousness. She felt her face redden and her throat begin to close up. She couldn't talk at first, then only haltingly and in sputters. It raced through her mind she should leave immediately or sooner. Her legs felt weak and she wondered if she could even stand. Someone shouted, "We want Anne! We want Anne!" And soon the entire hall reverberated with the chant, "We want Anne!" Anne looked helplessly at first Prosser, then B.J. Lassiter, obviously wanting to hear this wasn't happening. But it was. She muttered, "Did either of you know about this?" Prosser crossed his heart he didn't, and B.J. agreed. He also hadn't known this would happen. Anne realized she would have to say something, so she got to her feet and headed to the stage. She climbed the steps and was met at the top by Lieutenant Johnson's outstretched hand. She took it with a slight nod and shook it. Her reddening had deepened, and she could feel the heat in her face. A frown creased her forehead, and she muttered, "I should leave right now. You should have told me ahead of time." "It wouldn't have been the same," Johnson said with a grin. He knew she wouldn't leave. Johnson stepped back to the podium and addressed the hall. "There's always something or other that bothers a police officer from time to time, but I think we can all agree nothing bothers us as much as not knowing how a really hard case is solved. Detective Barton has solved just such a case that for 4 years went unsolved. And how did she do it? We don't really know. Maybe here and now, if we ask her very nicely, she will finally explain to us just how she did it. Now, without further ado, I give you the pride of Tulsa City, Ohio, Detective Ann Barton." The hall erupted in applause as Ann stepped up to the podium. She looked around and with a wave of her hand, she quieted the hall. Then a strange thing happened. Her fear left her and was replaced with a feeling of calm. The red left her face and strength returned to her legs. All at once she knew everything would be all right. "Detectives and reporters," she said, "I didn't know I would be called upon to speak at this seminar, so I have nothing prepared. I have already told how I was lucky enough to solve the murder in Tulsa City. I guess everybody has heard it by now. I got lucky. That's about it." The hall was quiet. Everyone waited for the next thing Anne would say. But Anne had stopped talking. She was about to thank the crowd and excuse herself when someone shouted, "There's got to be more to it than what you've already told. Cases don't just solve themselves. What else happened to aid in solving that murder?" Someone added, "Yeah, what else? You owe it to the rest of us to tell us. Remember, we're all in this same business." Anne pondered the question and wondered what she could say that would be all right. Her mind flashed to the kid from the next town who had totaled her car with his pickup truck for no apparent reason, and Billy's house burning down also for no apparent reason. And she knew that she should say as nothing. She said, "I might be able to add a little to what I already told you, but not much." As she was finishing her sentence, a small amount of static was heard. There was a cough from the back of the hall, and Anne saw the back of a man walking out the room. Then the PA crackled and the sound went off. With a pop, Anne said, "Hello," into the mic, but nothing happened. Then all the lights in the hall went out, and the room was left in twilight. "What the hell?" someone said, and someone else asked, to no one in particular, "What happened?" Fear invaded her as Anne realized what had happened. She left the stage as quickly as she could. Lieutenant Johnson grabbed her arm to stop her, but Anne said, "I think that'll be all, Lieutenant. Maybe next year you'll have some place that will stand the strain, but don't look for me to be there. I'll see you." Anne's mind raced. She felt very anxious and tight. She thought of the back of the man she watched leaving the hall just before the lights went out. She knew she shouldn't recognize that man. She knew she had never seen him before, and she knew it was probably just some technical thing that went wrong. The sound man, Gary, probably has it fixed already. Anne heard her name called. She looked back toward the hall where the voice had come from and saw Gary, the man of whom she had just been thinking. She stopped and waited for him. He reached her, breathless from hurrying to catch her. "I'm glad I caught you before you got out of here. I know what the problem is, and I can have it fixed in 5 minutes. "Don't do it on my account," replied Anne. "I didn't have anything to say anyhow. Whoever set this thing up should have let me know that they meant to call on me." She hesitated a second. "And I wouldn't even have come." "Please come back in," Gary pleaded. "My sound system hasn't even been heard yet, and I really want to test it out." Anne looked at Gary and, shaking her head, said, "You can test it all you want to, but not on me. Good luck. Now I've got to go." And she walked away. Now what to do? Anne wondered to herself. She contemplated another cup of coffee, but quickly nixed that. She decided to go to her room and call the chief and let him know what had happened, and that she was headed back to Tulsa City. She knew she would be disappointed and probably she knew he would be disappointed and probably order her to stay until the PA got fixed. She wondered if the chief had known she would be called on to talk to the seminar. She hoped not. That would really piss her off. She pushed the button for the elevator and decided to use the stairs. Maybe the exercise would calm her nerves. She quickly ascended the stairs to the second floor and headed toward her room. As she walked down the hallway, something made her stop. It wasn't a sound. She didn't know what it was, but she knew someone was watching from the hallway behind her. Her shoulders stiffened and the hair stood up on the back of her neck. Her hands curled into fists and she felt a surge of adrenaline. She whirled around, ready for anything. "Whoa, Detective," Prosser said as he quickly backed away from her. "Oh, it's only you," Anne said. She felt her body relax. A question mark appeared over his head. "Who did you expect to see?" he asked. "You were ready to fight." Anne turned and started on down the hall. "Nobody, I guess," she replied. "Nobody at all." Folks, that's the end of Chapter 10 of A Detective Story. This is JC. I hope that you'll come back and our Chapter 11 of A Detective Story. I hope you'll come back and listen to the last 2 chapters of it. And I hope you enjoyed this. Until then, this is JC, and I'll see you down the road if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise.